Hello, my name is Marko Keba. We are at ETK Agile Day 2012, a conference that is being organized for the first time in our Agile community. And we have a privilege to talk to Gojko Adzic. So maybe to start the whole discussion off, could you please just give a brief introduction of yourself?
Hello, my name is Gojko and I'm a software consultant. I work with teams to improve the quality of their products and processes, mostly in the area of reducing the suffering caused by Water-scrum-fall and helping people optimize their requirements or testing and fold their process into much shorter iterations. That's a nice summary, I guess.
Okay, your name is somehow usually tied mostly to the BDD, ATDD, specification by example. So is there a difference between the three, and if there, what would be the difference between the three?
So that depends on who you talk to, I guess. ATDD and BDD and specification by example are all kind of in a very, very similar space. And I think as a community, 10 years ago, people were mostly talking about, 5 years ago, people were mostly talking about acceptance test-driven development because it was a natural extension of test-driven development. And I think that name is particularly bad because of the name of the word test in it. And for a lot of people, because it was talking about something, test something, that's all they heard, and decided to completely ignore it. There was a big problem getting business people engaged in particular in participating there because they don't have, there's nothing for them to do in testing. Dan North came up with the name of behavior-driven development because of the same problem. He tried to get business people engaged and realized that they very negatively respond to anything that has to do with testing, and said, well, this is not about testing, it's about describing system behaviors. So kind of he called it behavior-driven development. And now I think behavior-driven development is quite a popular term. It's getting a lot of traction in the community, but then there's a lot of people driving it in lots of different directions. There's Liz Keogh and Chris Matz who are driving it in the direction of feature injection. There's a lot of other things. And I think for a long time, BDD has been basically what Dan North is concerned about at the moment. And there are a lot of definitions all floating around the internet that are very, very vague. And again, I had a big problem of getting business people engaged in something called behavior-driven development. So kind of specification by example is another name that's been around for a long time, and I think is the least worst of all names, because it does get business people engaged, it does get everybody engaged, and it kind of creates the right mental image of what this thing is supposed to do.
So basically the same concept is being taught by the whole tree, we can say.
I think the concepts are the same, and again, depending on what you consider BDD, so some people consider behavior-driven development a fully fledged methodology. So there are articles online how BDD is a methodology that involves pool, involves outside-in design, it involves specification use examples, it involves a lot of other things. And kind of spec by example is just a technique, it's not a methodology. It's a narrow part of that big view that deals with getting business people, developers, and testers engaged in a collaborative conversation to define the right requirements and describe the right product and align everybody's expectations and create a shared understanding just before we need to start delivering. So that reduces a lot of scope creep, it reduces a lot of waste caused by misalignment of development and testing with the business. It causes a lot of, it reduces a lot of waste caused by context switching and late feedback. But it's a technique, it's definitely not a methodology. It's a technique useful in a range of different methodologies, including XP, including Kanban, including Scrum, including BDD, if you consider BDD a methodology.
Okay, what would be just in a short, very short summary, like a 1 or 2 minute, what is actually specification by example?
Specification by example is a collaborative approach to defining specifications and tests, very useful for teams that work in short iterations or in a flow-based mode like Kanban. It relies on people from different roles getting together to discuss user stories or use cases through examples and turn those examples into the start of a definition of done, into a shared agreement on what a particular user story is. Specification by example has the effect of reducing cycle time, the time from when something gets accepted until it goes live, very often by 4 or 5 times, and has the effect of reducing the number of business problems coming back from production or from testing systems from when the point we thought they were done, because it helps teams collaboratively decide much better on what is it that they actually want to do and align better with the business stakeholders, define much more precisely the target of being done, and from that perspective allows also developers and testers to define tests up front, and then allows that the execution of those tests to be offloaded to whoever has time. In many cases, testers are testers are the bottleneck in a development cycle, because in our industry there are typically many more developers than testers on a team. Specification by example allows developers, testers, and business people to come up with good examples together that become the base of testing, that then developers can then become responsible for executing, where testers get more time to deal with some more important things. So it kind of removes several big bottlenecks of information and understanding from a development process.
Okay, but the whole concept is kind of agnostic to the methodology that the team is using.
I think that the concept relies on a team working on relatively small pieces of software in either short iterations or pull-based systems. I know of one company that tried to do something like this on a typical waterfall cycle, and they say they got big benefits because they got better alignment of delivery and testing and business, but I've never worked with a team that does not do short iterations or kind of a lean-based system, Kanban-based system that kind of does this. So I think it's agnostic of methodology in a sense that yes, you can do it with Scrum, XP, Kanban, BDD if it's a methodology, but you do need short iterations. And actually, as we are moving to shorter and shorter iterations, Spec by example becomes more possible, but also much more important, because with such a high frequency of change, other ways of communicating requirements and other ways of specifying become too bureaucratic or very kind of inefficient, where Spec by example works really well. So I think that kind of the move to shorter iterations is something that both benefits and requires specification by example.
Okay, so does the type or size of the business make a difference in adopting the specification by example approach?
I think kind of as an approach to requirements and tests, Spec by example solves communication problems. It solves communication problems where these problems start from a complex domain or a complex organization. So in an organization that's not very complex, where for example, it's a startup and you have two or three developers and there's no business domain there, there's no kind of, or there's no business complexity, Spec by example would not help. If you have a team of 10, 15 people, that's where you can already start getting some communication problems, and you need to get good alignment, especially if the business domain is complex enough so that developers and testers are not really domain experts. This is where kind of Spec by example really works well. For very small organizations or for domains where the key complexity is not really in the business, the key complexity is technical, where, for example, we have 500 database tables, we need to create a website that for each of those tables has a screen to enter the data. There's no domain complexity there, so Spec by example would not really help as an approach.
Mm-hmm. There's no communication gap.
There's no communication gap to be solved, so this would be a complete overkill.
Okay. So you mentioned in today's presentation that specification by example is test-driven development for business. How would you explain
I think that's one very easy way of selling it. Ken Beck in his original work on test-driven development, TDD Explained, for example, says that talks about customer tests and unit tests, and he talks about unit tests driving the development effort from a technical perspective and customer tests driving the development effort from the business perspective, because they capture what we want from a business side, and that becomes the light at the end of the tunnel. We aim to fulfill that. So over the last 10 years or so, the definition of TDD seems to have narrowed down to exclude the business perspective, to include only technical unit tests and driving the design of the code. So I kind of, to people who have that level of understanding of TDD, I explained that, well, Spec by example is the missing piece. Spec by example is what can be called customer test. This is kind of test-driven development applied to business rules, not just the technical perspective.
Okay. Okay, and so there is a certain number of discussions or specification workshops that should take place. Now, who is supposed to be present in the workshops, and how often and for how long should they take?
So one of the core aspects of specification by example is getting early feedback on whether we have good understanding. And when I say we, that means developers, testers, business analysts, product owners, everybody who is involved in delivering a piece of software. Do we have the same understanding of what's going to happen? And the way that's done in the specification by example mode is to organize either a specification workshop, that means the whole team gets together, or a smaller meeting where different roles through examples test their understanding. They try to agree on the examples, they try to list all the relevant examples that would capture everybody's understanding. So from perspective who needs to be involved, I strongly suggest that anybody who is involved in delivering software is involved in these conversations, because we need to make sure that everybody has the same understanding. Now, of course, some teams will be too big for everybody to be involved. Some teams will be distributed. Some teams will be, in different time zones, or might not be able to kind of communicate like that. But as a general rule of thumb, I really suggest that the whole team gets together. So if that's not possible, then there are alternatives like Three Amigos, which is a meeting between one business analyst, one tester, one developer, where those different roles come together. Okay. Some teams would kind of get their developers and testers to do these examples and then present them to a product owner or an analyst. And there are smaller options there, but I think my preferred way of doing this is to get everybody who is actually involved in delivering to come up with their perspectives and ensure that their understanding is the same as everybody else's, and also provide and contribute to this set of examples.
Okay, and what would be the adequate investment of time and the frequency of
So
the
that really depends. Most teams I work with would spend something like 2 or 3 hours for every 2 weeks of development, clarifying their requirements. In his book on the practices for scaling lean and agile, Craig Lahman says that basically good Scrum teams do between 5 to 10% of their iteration in product backlog refinement. So Spec by example is one of the core elements of that. So that would mean that you spend from 5 to 10% of your iteration doing that. I think that's kind of the upper limit I would put on it. If you need to spend more than 10% of your iteration clarifying requirements, then you're effectively not spending the bulk of your time developing, which then begs the question, why do you need so much clarification?
Okay, maybe they're not clear to start with.
Maybe maybe we should invest a bit more in working with the business to clarify things. And like many teams do that. Many teams, for example, get the business analyst to start working with external customers to prepare some initial examples, and then start this conversation much more effectively because they do have some initial preparation done.
Okay, and based on your experience, what would be some mistakes that companies are making with trying to implement this approach?
One of the most common mistakes is to focus too much on testing. I said, with the acceptance test-driven approach, and even with behavior-driven development as a name, there are a lot of comments online how, this is purely for testing, and I think approaching this thing from a purely testing perspective gives you the testing perspective. It doesn't give you the development or the business perspective, and then make sure that you have the same understanding. So a lot of the teams fail miserably by giving this thing to testers and saying, look, go and write all these specs with examples and test them. But then that completely misses the point of engaging different roles in communicating. So the other mistake is kind of from a completely different end, where teams expect that product owners provide all the examples. Again, that completely misses the point of having developers and testers discussing these things. So some other typical mistakes that people do are capturing examples and capturing their specifications and automating them in a way that makes it very, very difficult to maintain these things, because they don't realize that over the course of a year or 2 years, they will end up with several thousand or even several tens of thousands of tests. And then they can get into a situation where a user story breaks 5,000 tests. And at this point, you have to either throw these tests away or slow down to start fixing tests. And that's one of the most common problems that kind of people really don't understand, that when a user story breaks 10 tests, that's a sign of trouble. That's a sign that the models we have in our tests are not really aligned with the models in the business. And we should remodel our tests, we should reorganize the tests at that point, not at the point where kind of a user story starts breaking hundreds of tests.
You have mentioned at the very beginning of the discussion Water-scrum-fall. What is Water-scrum-fall?
Well, Water-scrum-fall is a name that Forrester Research gave to the way they see companies implement Agile. And that describes one of the most common mistakes, I guess, the way companies do that now is they said, well, companies have a big business decision-making phase up front, and then there's some kind of iterative cycle in the middle, and then there's again a big business decision-making phase after this thing. And for example, one of my clients, when I visited them, said that they do Scrum by the book, and we said, okay, tell me what that means. And they said, well, we have 2-week iterations. I said, okay. Does that mean the software goes live after those 2 weeks? He said, no, actually we do 5 iterations in a block. He says, what does that mean? Well, we do 2-week iterations, and we do 5 of them. I said, does the software go live after that? He said, no, there's a testing iteration after that. I said, okay, so you do 5 development iterations, there's a testing iteration after. So that's 6 2-week blocks. That's 12 weeks. Does the software go live after that? I said, not really, we run stuff in 3 blocks. So they actually have a 36-week cycle. And we said, okay, so your really kind of time from when people accept something into development until it goes live is 36 weeks. And I said, no, it's about 1.5 years. I said, okay, so out of 1.5 years, kind of how can you honestly look in the mirror and say, we have a 2-week iteration? So the problem they had is basically, even with those 36 weeks, they had 1 year of decision making up front to kind of approve everything and who knows what, and then they had this marinating phase at the end where when the software passes all their internal tests, they still keep it in staging to marinate and improve for God knows what. And this is what the guys at Forrester Research call kind of Water-scrum-fall. It's Scrum inside of a waterfall that's applied only to development. It's not applied really to any testing or not applied to any kind of requirements and business decision making, which is, according to Forrester Research, one of the most common ways people actually end up implementing Agile, and I think is horribly, horribly wrong.
Yeah, to be honest, in the last, we can say, 3 or 4 years, that Agile and Lean and Scrum in particular have taken a lot of, I would say, time and effort for people to implement them because everybody else does it, so we need to do it as well. And somehow people are trying to do Agile, but by not being Agile. And how would you say that bridging that gap happens?
There's a cargo cult around anything that becomes popular, and I think, part of Scrum becoming popular is that there will be so many people misusing it. And people present Kanban as a solution now, but I can guarantee you that in about 5 years we will hear the same thing about Kanban. We will hear about horrible misuses and things like that. So I think that's software is difficult. So building good software is not easy, and unfortunately there's no magical potion or silver bullet that solves everything. Yet a lot of people who just do not want to look themselves in the mirror and say, well, we have 1.5 years of business decision making and let's try and solve that, they start optimizing the wrong thing. And this is why Scrum, although it's a very good idea, that does not work for people like that. Especially a lot of organizations completely forget that one of the core parts of Scrum is statistical process control. Scrum was designed to give people regular feedback at regular intervals. So every iteration you have these things you need to do to collect feedback, to collect your process metrics and understand how to improve. And for a lot of people who have this kind of horrible Scrum implementation, retrospectives are just a big tree-hugging exercise where everybody says, we're fantastic, instead of actually thinking, well, what is our process at the moment and how do we improve it over time? I see the same thing with kind of Kanban teams where, you know, they create a Kanban board, they create a queue for, I don't know, testing, and that queue starts accumulating things for weeks, and nobody asks a question like, how do we fix this? So both Scrum and Kanban are mirrors. They are mirrors that show teams where the process is wrong. They don't tell us how to fix the process, but they tell us where the process is wrong. Now, it's up to the team to decide whether they will act on that information or just ignore it. And unfortunately, a lot of teams just ignore that kind of information, and, you know, they have something, but it's not a good process.
Okay. Maybe to end the conversation, would you have any last tips or advice for the Agile community in Croatia and in Ericsson?
I think, you know, going back to our discussion, I think it's very, very important to adopt the principles and adapt the practices. A lot of people end up in a cargo cult by adopting the practices and completely forgetting the principles and ignoring them, and doing things even if they don't make sense in their environment, and actually kind of not doing things that they should be doing. So I think if you look at Agile, you know, one of the core principles of Agile is getting fast feedback and getting good engagement with the business people, and making sure that kind of, you know, everybody is responsible for delivering high quality software as a kind of cross-functional group. And lots of people kind of just adopt slavishly practices like, okay, we will do a 2-week iteration, and we do a stand-up at the start, and we do a retrospective at the end, but stand-ups don't provide any useful information to anybody, and retrospectives are just kind of a review that never leads to any useful actions. And I think that's a big danger that I see lots of people doing. So I think, you know, my last words are avoid doing that, avoid doing things just because everybody does that. Make sure you know why you're doing certain things and what change you expect in your process from implementing any of these things. And then measure whether you got the change or not. And if not, then modify your process or start doing something else.
Right. Thanks a lot, Gojko.
Thank you.